1.25 miles of freezing current separates Alcatraz Island from the lights of San Francisco. Close enough that inmates could hear the city breathing. A New Year's Eve party drifting across the water. A ferry horn. A woman laughing on a pier. Far enough that not one confirmed escape ever made it back to shore alive. Opened as a federal penitentiary in August 1934, Alcatraz was never built to reform anyone. It was built to hold the men every other prison in America had already failed to hold. Inside, existence was stripped to 4 things only: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else, a radio, a book, a conversation in the yard, had to be earned and could be taken away in an instant. To the public, the Rock was the final word in American justice. A place where wealth, fame, and violence all meant nothing once the cell door closed. To the men inside it, it was something closer to a controlled experiment in how much isolation a human mind can absorb before it starts to fail. The 5 inmates in this file did not simply serve time on that island. Each one, in a different way, became a case study in what Alcatraz was actually designed to do to a man. If you want the real, verified history behind the myths Hollywood built around this island, hit subscribe before we start, because this channel corrects the record every week. Case number 1. Alphonse Capone. August 22, 1934. A prison train pulls in under heavy guard, its cargo manifest listing the passengers only as furniture. Inside one of the cars sits the most recognizable criminal in the United States, a man who once ran Chicago's underworld from a private cell in Atlanta, complete with carpet, a radio, and paid guards. Within minutes of stepping onto the dock at Alcatraz, all of it disappears. He is logged in as federal prisoner number 85. Not Scarface. Not public enemy number 1. 85. Alphonse Capone was born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents, one of 9 children in a working-class household. He left school for good in the 6th grade after striking a teacher, and by his teenage years he was running with street gangs on the Brooklyn waterfront. In 1919, his mentor, Johnny Torrio, brought him to Chicago to work as a bouncer and enforcer in Torrio's brothels and gambling houses. It was almost certainly during this period, moving through the city's underworld of prostitution rings, that Capone contracted syphilis, a disease he was reportedly aware of and chose never to treat. Through the 1920s, Capone built an empire on bootleg liquor, gambling, and prostitution, worth by some estimates over $100 million at its peak. He eliminated rivals without hesitation. The February 1929 killing of 7 members of a rival gang in a Clark Street garage, an event that became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, is widely attributed to his organization, though he was never charged for it. In the end, it was not murder or bootlegging that put him away. Federal prosecutors convicted him of income tax evasion in 1931, and he was sentenced to 11 years. At Atlanta Penitentiary, Capone continued operating almost as he had on the outside, bribing his way into private quarters and staying in contact with his Chicago organization. That was exactly the loophole Alcatraz was built to close. Federal authorities transferred him specifically to sever those ties, and once he arrived, the transformation was immediate. He was assigned to menial labor like every other inmate, sweeping floors and later working in the prison's shoe shop and laundry. Stripped of his money and his muscle, Capone became a target. In February 1935, he was involved in a violent altercation with a fellow laundry worker, a fight serious enough to require medical attention, though the identity of the other man was kept out of official records at the time. A more famous incident followed in June 1936. While standing in line for a haircut in the prison barbershop, inmate James Lucas confronted Capone over an old grudge and stabbed him with a pair of barber's shears. The wound was superficial, and Capone was released from the prison hospital within days, but the message from the general population was clear. On Alcatraz, his name bought him nothing. It was not violence that eventually broke him. It was the disease he had ignored for over a decade. By 1938, untreated syphilis had progressed into neurosyphilis, and Capone's mental state began to deteriorate visibly. Guards documented episodes of confusion, disorientation, and an inability to follow simple instructions. He was formally diagnosed with syphilis of the brain in February 1938. Prison doctors attempted an experimental malaria fever treatment, deliberately infecting him with malaria to induce high fevers thought to kill the syphilis bacteria. The treatment nearly killed him outright, and it did nothing to reverse the damage already done. Despite the deterioration, Capone was allowed one privilege that softened his final years on the island. He lobbied the warden for over a year to form a prison band, and was eventually granted 20 minutes of practice a day. He learned the banjo from scratch, taught himself to read music, and became a founding member of a group of inmates who called themselves the Rock Islanders, an ensemble that at one point included fellow inmate George Kelly on drums. Warden James Johnston later wrote that he could pick Capone out of any prisoner lineup instantly, always grinning, always working an angle, forever trying to position himself as the unofficial spokesman for the other inmates during head counts. It never worked. Johnston ran Alcatraz on a strict philosophy that privileges were earned, never assumed, and Capone's fame bought him no exceptions. Life inside his 5-by-9-foot cell followed the same rigid schedule as every other prisoner on the island: work, meals, a strictly timed hour in the yard, and long stretches of silence broken only by the sound of the bay wind against the cell block walls. As his neurosyphilis advanced, prison doctors turned to one of the era's more desperate treatments, deliberately infecting him with malaria to trigger fevers believed capable of killing the syphilis bacteria in his brain. The fevers came close to killing him outright on 2 separate occasions and did nothing to reverse the neurological damage already done. In January 1939, with his condition worsening and his sentence largely served, he was transferred to Terminal Island in Southern California to finish out his term in a lower security setting. He was released that November, a shell of the man who had once run an entire city. In 1942, he became one of the first patients in the country to receive the newly available drug penicillin, a treatment that could have cured him outright had it existed a decade earlier. It slowed the disease but could not undo it, and he died in 1947 at his Florida estate, his mind and body destroyed by an infection he had chosen never to treat. Case number 2, Robert Stroud. March 26, 1916. The noon meal is underway in the mess hall at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, more than 1,000 inmates seated in rows. A guard named Andrew Turner walks the floor doing head count. An inmate approaches him, calm, almost polite, and asks a single question. "Did you report me?" Turner says no. The inmate does not respond with words. He drives a sharpened case knife into Turner's chest, in full view of every man in the room, and walks away as the guard collapses. That inmate is Robert Stroud, and by the time Alcatraz opens 18 years later, his name will already be one of the most infamous in the federal prison system. Stroud was born in Seattle in 1890, the eldest child in a household defined by his father's drinking and violence. His mother had already survived an abusive first marriage before entering a second one that offered little improvement, and by 13, Stroud had run away for good, drifting north into Alaska Territory. By 18, he was living there as a pimp. In January 1909, he shot and killed a bartender named Charlie Von Dahmer after Von Dahmer assaulted one of the women Stroud managed. He was convicted of manslaughter and sent to the federal penitentiary on McNeil Island to serve a 12-year sentence. Prison did nothing to calm him. He stabbed a fellow inmate over a food theft accusation and assaulted a hospital orderly, earning an additional 6 months and a transfer to the far harsher Leavenworth Penitentiary in 1912. It was there, 4 years later, that he murdered guard Andrew Turner over what had begun as a denied visitation privilege. Convicted of first-degree murder, Stroud was sentenced to hang. His mother spent years petitioning on his behalf, and in 1920 she succeeded in reaching President Woodrow Wilson, who commuted the sentence to life in solitary confinement. It was inside that isolation, sealed away from nearly all human contact, that Stroud found a nest of injured sparrows in the recreation yard and began, almost by accident, a career as an ornithologist. Prison officials initially allowed it, believing the hobby would occupy a dangerous mind productively. Over the following 2 decades, he raised and studied hundreds of canaries in 2 connected segregation cells, converted into a working lab, published research on avian disease that was taken seriously by professional bird breeders nationwide, and wrote 2 books, one a full-length study of poultry pathology still cited by aviculturists today. The public, and later Hollywood, would come to know him as the gentle Birdman of Alcatraz. The men who actually worked and lived alongside him described someone very different. A manipulative and frequently dangerous prisoner who used his lab equipment to distill homemade alcohol and who racked up a long internal disciplinary file even during his supposedly rehabilitated years at Leavenworth. On December 19, 1942, with only 10 minutes' notice, he was pulled from Leavenworth and transferred to Alcatraz as inmate 594. His birds, his equipment, and his life's work were shipped off to his brother. He would never keep another bird again, and the authorities never allowed him to publish either of his manuscripts while he was alive. Alcatraz placed him directly into D Block, the prison's most severe segregation unit, where he would spend 6 consecutive years in near total isolation, followed by another 11 years confined to the prison hospital wing for medical and psychiatric reasons. A total of 17 years on the island without ever entering the general population. Psychiatric evaluations conducted during this stretch diagnosed him as a psychopath, while placing his intelligence well above average, though the exact figures reported over the years vary by source. In May 1946, during the violent uprising known as the Battle of Alcatraz, when armed inmates seized D Block and a 2-day gun battle with guards and Marines followed, the 56-year-old Stroud reportedly moved along the segregation tier, closing the heavy steel doors of isolation cells to shield the men trapped inside from stray gunfire, then shouted up to the guards that there were no weapons on the block, an act that likely saved lives during one of the deadliest incidents in the prison's history. His health finally failing, Stroud was transferred out of Alcatraz in 1959 to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He died there in 1963, having spent 54 consecutive years behind bars, one of the longest single incarcerations in American federal history, and having never once been allowed to see the film that made him famous. He was found dead in his cell by a fellow inmate, the convicted spy Morton Sobel, one of the very few men who considered him a genuine friend. When journalists later asked former Alcatraz inmates whether Burt Lancaster's gentle portrayal matched the man they had actually known, the answer was consistently the same. It did not. The Robert Stroud who lived among them was remembered not as a misunderstood scientist, but as someone who thrived on conflict, a reputation the movie's soft focus lens never had any interest in showing. Case number 3, Henri Young. December 3rd, 1940, 10 o'clock count has just cleared in the Industries building. Inmate Henri Young comes down the stairs from the furniture shop and crosses the floor toward the tailoring shop below. In his hand is a wooden spoon, filed for weeks against the concrete until its edge could open skin. He finds Rufus McCain at his workstation and drives the sharpened spoon into him before anyone can react. McCain goes into shock almost immediately and dies 5 hours later. To the warden, it is an open and shut case of inmate murder. What happens next in a San Francisco courtroom will turn into one of the most consequential trials in the history of the federal prison system. Young was born in Kansas City in 1911 and built a criminal record around armed robbery and hostage-taking, culminating in a 1933 murder conviction in Washington state for killing a taxi driver during a robbery. His eventual victim, Rufus McCain, was no minor figure either. Born in Texas in 1903, McCain had his own long record of grave robbery, bank robbery, and a violent prison break from an Arkansas facility that ended in a deputy sheriff's death, a history serious enough to land him at Alcatraz years before Young's own arrival. After serving time in state facilities in Montana and Washington, he entered the federal system in 1935 through McNeil Island, and his escalating record of violence and escape attempts eventually earned him a transfer to Alcatraz as inmate 244. On the night of January 13, 1939, Young joined 4 other inmates, including Arthur Doc Barker, in a coordinated escape attempt. Barker is believed to have engineered most of the plan, having already been involved in earlier failed breakouts. The group spent weeks in the isolation unit, hiding hacksaw work behind putty and paint, before finally cutting through their cell bars and the cell house window, then slipping out under cover of fog to the island's rocky western shoreline. They built a raft from driftwood and bedsheets, but McCain, unable to swim, twice begged the group to turn back and reinforce it before they tried to launch. Both delays gave pursuing guards time to close the gap. The attempt collapsed on the beach. Barker refused to surrender and was shot and later died of his wounds. Young, McCain, and a third inmate gave themselves up on the shore. As punishment, both men were placed in disciplinary segregation, standard isolation cells equipped with a cot, plumbing, and electric light, not the underground, unheated dungeon cells that later became part of Young's own legend. Records place his time in segregation at several months, not years, and he was back in the general population by the autumn of 1939. More than a year passed between his release and McCain's killing, which undercuts the idea of an immediate psychotic break. According to fellow inmate Alvin Karpus, Young had come to blame McCain for the failed escape, since McCain, unable to swim, had begged the group to turn back twice while building their raft, costing them the time that let guards catch up. Whatever the precise motive, on December 3rd, 1940, Young acted on it with the filed spoon. His 1941 trial for McCain's murder became something far larger than a single killing. Young's defense attorneys built their case not around denying the stabbing, but around putting the conditions of Alcatraz itself on trial, arguing that years of institutional cruelty had left their client unable to control his actions. More than 20 former and current inmates took the stand describing conditions in D Block, extended stretches without light, restricted bread and water diets, and physical abuse by guards. The jury was taken on a tour of the actual isolation cells, and according to court records, described what they saw as unbelievably brutal and inhuman. Whether or not Young's own confinement matched the worst of that testimony, the jury's reaction to Alcatraz's disciplinary practices was real, and it was enough. They acquitted him of first and second-degree murder and convicted him only of involuntary manslaughter, adding 3 years to his sentence. Young remained on Alcatraz until 1948, when he was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri in 1954. With his federal sentence complete, he was handed over to Washington state authorities to finally begin serving his original 1933 murder sentence at Walla Walla. He did not simply wait it out. At some point, he escaped from that state facility, and by September 1967, he had spent enough time at large to earn a spot on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He was eventually recognized from a magazine article and arrested in Kansas City in January 1968, then returned to Walla Walla to finish his sentence. He was finally released on parole in 1972 at age 61. Within a short time, he violated that parole and disappeared for good. He has never been found, and his fate remains officially unknown to this day. Case number 4. George Machine Gun Kelly. September 26, 1933, before sunrise, a dozen federal agents and Memphis police surround a small house on a quiet residential street. Inside, wanted for the kidnapping of oil tycoon Charles Urschel and a $200,000 ransom, is the man newspapers have spent months building into America's most feared gangster, a machine gun-toting outlaw said to have gunned down policemen across 3 states. When agents force the door, they find him hungover in his pajamas, unarmed, and offering no resistance at all. The dramatic surrender line later attributed to him, screaming "Don't shoot, G-men," appears nowhere in the FBI's own written report from days after the arrest, and is now widely regarded by historians as a myth invented by the press months later. The real George Kelly gave up without a word. Kelly was born George Kelly Barnes in Memphis, Tennessee in 1895 into a comfortable, upper-middle-class insurance family, a background almost unheard of among his Depression-era outlaw contemporaries. In 1917, he enrolled at Mississippi A&M to study agriculture, But he was a poor fit for academic life, racking up dozens of demerits in his first semester alone before dropping out entirely. He drifted into bootlegging soon after, was arrested and served time at Leavenworth in 1928 for smuggling liquor onto an Indian reservation, and by his own account, served his sentence as a model prisoner, which earned him early release. Through the early 1930s, he graduated from small-time liquor, running into armed bank robbery across several states. And in 1930, he married Catherine Thorne, a woman with her own criminal connections who is widely credited, though the full extent is debated by historians, with shaping his public image, reportedly buying him his signature Thompson submachine gun and promoting his gangster reputation to the underworld and the press. In July 1933, Kelly and an accomplice kidnapped Oklahoma oil executive Charles Urschel from his own home, holding him for 8 days before collecting a $200,000 ransom, a fortune equivalent to several $1 million today. Urschel, despite being blindfolded through most of his captivity, paid close attention to every sound, smell, and scrap of conversation he could pick up, later using those details to help investigators pinpoint a specific ranch in rural Texas where he had been held. Federal agents had also recorded the serial numbers on the ransom bills before the drop, and as that marked money began surfacing in banks and businesses across the region, the net closed quickly. Kelly and Catherine fled for weeks, moving between safe houses in Texas and Mississippi before being cornered at a friend's home in Memphis. Both were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, along with several accomplices who received lesser terms. Kelly was first sent to Leavenworth, where he reportedly bragged to other inmates about breaking out before the holidays, boasts that were almost certainly empty, but that federal officials had no interest in testing. That talk alone was enough to get him classified as an escape risk and transferred to Alcatraz, where he arrived in September 1934 as inmate 117, among the first group of prisoners to enter the newly opened penitentiary. The press expected a violent, headline-chasing gangster to match his fearsome nickname. What they got instead was almost the opposite. Separated from Catherine and stripped of the carefully built public persona she had constructed for him, Kelly settled into life on the Rock as one of its most cooperative and unremarkable inmates. He avoided the hunger strikes and work stoppages that periodically swept through the population, stayed out of yard confrontations, and earned a reputation among guards as reliable and polite, to the point that staff began calling him Pop. He played drums in the prison's inmate band alongside fellow prisoner Al Capone, worked steadily in the prison industries, and reportedly spent much of his free time telling younger inmates exaggerated stories of his bootlegging days. Inmate Willie Radke, who occupied a neighboring cell for years, later described nightly routines of Kelly accusing him of snoring and reaching out through the bars to swat him with a rolled-up magazine, the closest thing to conflict the once-feared gangster seemed capable of producing anymore. Prison records also show Kelly repeatedly writing remorseful letters to Charles Urschel, the man he had kidnapped, pleading for his help securing parole. Urschel never answered a single one. For 17 years, the man once billed as public enemy number 1 quietly did his time as a model prisoner, a transformation that Alcatraz's isolation, more than anything else, seems to have produced. In 1951, with his health beginning to decline, Kelly was transferred back to Leavenworth, closer to his family. He died there of a heart attack on July 18, 1954, which happened to be his 59th birthday. Case number 5, Frank Morris. Late on the night of June 11, 1962, a guard walks the tier at Alcatraz, doing a routine bed check. Nothing looks wrong. 3 inmates lie sleeping under their blankets, faces turned slightly away from the bars, just visible enough in the dim light to pass inspection. It is not until the next morning that anyone realizes the faces are not faces at all. They are dummy heads, built from soap, toilet paper, flesh-toned paint, and real human hair swept up from the prison barbershop floor. Behind them, the actual occupants of those cells are already gone, and Alcatraz is about to lose one of only 3 confirmed successful escapes in its entire history. Frank Lee Morris was born in Washington, D.C. in 1926 the son of a mother who never disclosed his father's identity. Orphaned in the practical sense by age 11, he was raised in a string of foster homes before being sentenced at 13 to the National Training School for Boys, a reform school where he was taught to repair shoes. He escaped that institution once as a teenager and spent much of his adolescence and early adulthood cycling in and out of custody for burglary, narcotics possession, and armed robbery. Intelligence testing conducted during his incarceration placed his IQ at 133, ranking him in the top 2% of the general population, a fact prison officials noted with some unease given his equally consistent record as an escape risk. After escaping once from the Louisiana State Penitentiary, one of the most secure state prisons in the country, he was eventually recaptured and, given his combination of intellect and escape history, classified for transfer to the one facility built specifically to hold men like him. He arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960 as inmate 1441. Morris was not placed alongside the Anglin brothers immediately. John Anglin, a career burglar from a large Georgia farming family with his own history of escape attempts, was moved into a cell next to Morris later in 1960, and his brother Clarence followed into the block in early 1961. The three men had crossed paths in other prison systems before, and once reunited on Alcatraz, recognized in each other the same restless determination to get off the island. Morris, regarded by both the Anglins and prison staff as the operation's clear strategist, began quietly assembling the most sophisticated breakout plan in the prison's history. Working through late 1961 and into 1962, the group used a drill improvised from a stolen vacuum cleaner motor, along with sharpened spoons, to slowly enlarge the ventilation openings at the back of their cells, openings that led to an unused utility corridor running behind the cell block. To mask the sound of their work, a fourth inmate, Alan West, played the accordion during the evening hours when the noise would otherwise have carried. The men disguised the growing holes with painted cardboard grates that passed inspection for months. The most elaborate part of the plan was the set of decoy heads, sculpted with startling realism to fool the night guards during bed checks, buying the escapees precious hours before anyone would notice they were gone. On the night of June 11, 1962, Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through their enlarged vents into the utility corridor, climbed to the cell house roof, and made their way to the shoreline, where they launched a makeshift raft built from more than 50 stolen rubber raincoats, sealed and inflated using a concertina. West, delayed by concrete that had hardened around his own vent opening, never made it out in time and was left behind, later cooperating fully with the investigation that followed. Morris and the Anglins were never seen again. Guards did not discover the escape until well into the following morning, by which point the trio had a head start of several hours in dark, frigid water. An extensive search by the FBI, Coast Guard, and military turned up no confirmed trace of the three men, no bodies, and no verified sightings on the mainland. In 1979, the FBI officially concluded, based on the water temperature and the strong currents running through the bay that night, that all three most likely drowned before reaching shore. The U.S. Marshals Service, however, has never formally closed the case, and it remains active into the present day, kept alive by a small number of disputed family claims, letters, and photographs submitted over the decades, none of which investigators have ever been able to verify. Whatever happened to Morris and the Anglin brothers in the water that night, their escape did what 4 decades of failed attempts before them could not. It shattered Alcatraz's reputation as escape-proof for good, and just 1 year later, citing the crumbling, saltwater-corroded infrastructure and the enormous cost of keeping the island secure, the federal government shut the prison down permanently, bringing its 29-year run as America's most feared penitentiary to an end. 5 men. 5 very different collisions with the same square mile of rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. A crime boss whose empire meant nothing against a disease he refused to treat. A killer whose violence never went away, even after the world decided to remember him for his birds. A convict whose one act of rage put the entire prison system on trial. an outlaw whose fearsome reputation collapsed the moment his wife was no longer there to maintain it, and a career criminal whose intelligence finally found a problem that Alcatraz itself could not solve. Alcatraz was built on a simple premise that no security system, no matter how total, could be beaten by the men it was designed to contain. For 4 of the men in this file, that premise held. For one of them, on one foggy night in June 1962, it did not. And the uncertainty of what happened to him afterward is the closest thing to an open wound this island still has. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and drop a comment telling us which prison we should take apart next.